Over the gums and through the lips. Look out, stomach. Here we go.
What do you believe? The people of the masses are deceived. You can go against the grain of flow with the mainstream. I keep it moving like the magi that's coming from the east. The wedding supper still ahead, gotta make it to the feast.
Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Luke McIntyre, and you are listening to the vertical discourse of God and Kings, where it's the glory of God to conceal a matter and the honor of kings to seek it out. Hope you're doing well. I was originally planning on doing an episode on the Tower of Babel, and slowly or quickly, either way, I started to realize that I had to lay some groundwork first, because there are certain things that just deserve their own episode. And so today, instead of talking about the Tower of Babel, we're going to be talking about a figure whose identity is very prominent when it comes to the Tower of Babel, but it may not be who you think it is. Today's episode is about an individual named Cush. Obviously, Cush is one of the sons of Ham, who you see in the Genesis 10 table of nations. And a lot of people want to say, oh, there was a curse of Ham. That was not the case at all. It was the curse of Canaan. But just the same, Ham's line had individuals in it who were corrupt and made certain decisions. Cush is one of those who you don't see a lot said about them, but I believe that when we begin to read between the lines and do a little digging, we find out some information that just adds to our biblical understanding. Now, something I want to address. One of the works that I'm going to be leaning on is from a man known as Alexander Hislop in his book, The Two Babylons. Now, if you ask some people, they'll say, oh, well, you can't use that source. It's been debunked by a whole bunch of different people. And my argument is, okay, cool. Who debunked it? They can't give me any names. What part did they debunk? They can't give me anything. And the reason is because his work is so dense and he leans on so many different sources. The arguments against him say that he jumps to conclusions just because this is here. It doesn't mean that it's associated with that. Well, what's the point in having logical reasoning? What's the point in doing any deductive research at all if we're told, hey, you can gather all the facts you want, but don't come to any sound conclusion? I think that's what he did, and I feel like it put specifically Papal Rome on blast. This is a fun tidbit that you might find interesting. When you look at John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, on this journey, he runs into these two giants. One of them is named Pagan and the other is named Pope, right? Pagan talking about mythologies of the past that people believed in, and Pope referring to the Catholic system that people believe in now, which is twin to the paganism of the past, right? Alexander Hislop's work expounds on that all the more. Now, obviously, the Catholic system is one that is in place and people are vying for, but it is demonic. Why else do you explain that you can find Catholic saints and things like that in stores with tarot cards and witchcraft? It doesn't make sense. But in modern renderings of the Pilgrim's Progress, they've taken out the two giants and they've just left the one named Pagan. And so I think it's important to know that even in a book like that, which was second only to the Bible during its time, more modern versions of it have taken that out. Alexander Hislop digs that up and people want to discredit him. But another thing that we have to do is we have to be willing to look at the work. Another thing that we have to do is we have to. It's a fly. I'm sorry. Something else that we have to be willing to do is look at all of the research that he did, because again, it is very dense. So when talking about Alexander Hislop, I'm going to tell you some of the other sources that we're going to be referring to because he goes over them. Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons was written in 1903. He leans on the work of Jacob Bryant. It's called A New System or an Analysis of Ancient Mythology, written in 1807. Christian K.J. Bunsen wrote Egypt's Place in the Universal History, written in 1848. Austin Henry Layard wrote Nineveh and Its Remains. He did a lot of archaeological work. That was written in 1849. Isaac Newton wrote The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, amended in 1728, before America was even founded. And then it also leans on the works of Trogus Pompeius, Marcus Justinus, Theodorus Siculus, Josephus, and a list of others. So again, this is not lightweight reading. So let's go ahead and jump into this. Genesis chapter 10, starting in verse 6. The sons of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Now, some people believe because of the ordering, Cush may have been the oldest and Canaan the youngest, but quite honestly, we don't know. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raama, and Sabtika. The sons of Raama, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now it's interesting. This is written in the Torah centuries upon centuries ago. But even by that time when Moses was alive, Nimrod was already a legend, right? So keep that in mind. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calneh, and Rezin, which is in between Nineveh and Calneh, which is the great city. And then, of course, you've got the name Nineveh there being one of the, the Hanging Gardens at Nineveh. That's one of the 7 wonders of the world, but that's unrelated. One of the things with Alexander Hislop is he identifies Cush directly with the Babylonian god Bel. And this is a title that he is careful to distinguish from a familiar title, Baal. He says, and it makes an argument that those two are not the same. Baal meaning specifically Lord. Bel in Hislop's reading means something closer to the confounder, and he argues it was Cush under this identity who actually instigated the Babel project in the first place. Now, something to keep in mind, when I go to the Bible and I look up the etymologies of words, which I recommend everybody do, the word for Baal or the word for Bel both come back to mean Lord or Master. So when you look at the Strong's Concordance, which you have to do, those things don't necessarily mean anything different. But you have to understand that we're talking about language here, especially during the times that languages split apart or were divided. To give you an example, the word Babel means confusion when you look at the Hebrew, but when you go to the Akkadian, Bab means gate or gateway and El means God. So it literally translates to gateway of God, which is what a temple is. It's a place where the presence of the divine is allowed into the earth, or where man is supposed to be able to transcend his place on earth to touch the divine. Again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Tower of Babel. So in mythology, or in history even, Bel is said to be the father of Ninus. Well, who is Ninus connected to? Nimrod, right? So if Nimrod is Ninus, it makes sense that Cush is Bel, but who is Bel associated with? He's associated with the Mesopotamian god Marduk, who is credited with defeating the primordial dragon Tiamat, entity of confusion. But what did we say that Bel means? The confounder. Hislop connects Cush further to Hermes, the god classical sources consistently credit with dividing human speech. We're going to talk about the connection with Hermes in just a little bit, but we don't want to forget about that because that's a very big piece. If Cush is connected with Hermes, then that has a lot of major implications that we can't just gloss over. Classical writers add a further layer to Cush's identity. Cush was widely understood in antiquity as the father of the Ethiopians, or the Ethiops. So obviously when you look at Ham, you've got Egypt, you've got Canaan, you've got Put, right? And we know that these are darker skinned people groups. So it makes sense that Cush would be known as the father of the Ethiopians or the Ethiops. They were also called Cushites at one point in time. So again, if we can't trace these names back, it's almost like ancestry.com. I don't know how legitimate they are. I'm not saying anything there or any of these other places. If you truly want to know something or about your history, you have to be willing to follow the line. And the places where the line is hard to follow end up being a blur. When we're trying to trace things back to the Bible, we have to understand and be able to follow language. And again, I believe that Alexander Hislop does an amazing job of connecting sources. And again, I'll say this. Anybody who is willing to say that Alexander Hislop's work is ill-founded because he's coming to his own conclusions. The Bible tells us to study to show ourselves approved. So by that same criteria, aren't we wrong for doing our own research? Or are we trying to commend ourselves to men when God told us to do that? I believe what he's doing is credible. Hislop uses this connection to link Cush's bloodline to later deified figures across the Mediterranean world, most notably Bacchus, who is described by ancient writers as the son of Ethiops. Now, if you know who Bacchus is, and I believe he's also associated with Dionysus or Dionysus in Greek mythology, he's the god of revelry. He's the god of wine and drinking. And we also know about this thing called the Bacchanalian Sun Festival, which is where they dance and worship the sun. And there's a lot of symbolism and imagery that has to deal with occult mysticism. And all of this is checking out when we're looking at Cush's person, especially when we connect it back to him being Hermes. I want to jump to a passage directly from the two Babylons really quickly, because I think that this will help to put things into perspective if I can find my notes. To the ordinary reader, the name of Bacchus suggests nothing more than revelry and drunkenness, but it is now well known that amid all the abominations that attend his orgies, the grand design was professedly the purification of souls, and that from the guilt and defilement of sin. So they literally claim that indulging in sin and revelry and drunkenness purges them from sin. Yeah, in order to purify yourself, you have to give into it. And it sounds crazy to us, but that's literally what people say now. It's just like, oh, well, if you feel like you need to do something, you should just go ahead and do it and get it out of your system. That's basically the same thing here. So we have to understand, if there's a mindset that we have that says just do something to get it out of your system and it's sinful, we have to understand that that mindset is demonic. This entire civilization and occult is built on that. If Ninus was Nimrod, who is the historical Bel? He must have been Cush, for Cush begat Nimrod. Genesis 10 verse 8. And Cush is generally represented as having been a ringleader in the great apostasy. But again, Cush, as the son of Ham, was Hermes or Mercury, for Hermes is just an Egyptian synonym for the son of Ham. Now, Hermes was the great original prophet of idolatry, for he was recognized by the pagans as the author of the religious rites and the interpreter of the gods. Interpreter, talking about languages, right? Why do you need interpretation if languages are not different? Religious rites. We talked about these Bacchanalian sun festivals, and understand that these different characters and these different deities and these mythologies are all different facets and different renderings of this satanic figure. Gesenius identifies him with the Babylonian Nebo as the prophetic god. A statement of Hyginus shows that he was known as the grand agent in the movement which produced the division of tongues. So again, all of these early writers are associating Cush directly with what happens at Babel, right? They're not overlooking Nimrod, because Nimrod plays a very important part, but the parts that they play are different. Nimrod is known as, it says that he began to be a mighty hunter before the Lord. So in a lot of ways, in my thinking, what we see Nimrod manifesting in the physical realm began in conception in Cush's mind. Okay. Cush to me sounds like the mouthpiece, and Nimrod was his offspring who carried out the work, right? And this isn't necessarily a hard concept when you think about Moses in the Bible. He used to have a stuttering problem. So we attribute all these things to Moses, but Aaron was the spokesperson. So I wonder if Cush played a similar role, right? But after that, Mercury interpreted the speeches of men, whence an interpreter is called hermeneutes, right? So that's where we get the term hermeneutics from. The same individual distributed the nations. Then discord began. Now, I want to point out something that's interesting, and it caught my attention when I was actually reading about Nimrod. It says he was the first who carried on war against his neighbors, talking about Nimrod. And that's really interesting there, because one of the words for tyrant is a rebel. And it struck me because in the word rebel is the word Bel. And I was like, okay, that doesn't have to mean anything, but far be it from me to just dismiss it because I don't see the connection, or the English language is just a conglomeration of a whole bunch of stuff that we can't really trace. There is an argument and a conspiracy, and I've been prone to believe it, and I've just haven't had time to really go down that rabbit hole, that the English language is in a lot of ways a language that was meant for witchcraft. What do I mean by that? It is a language that is meant to undo the work that was done at the Tower of Babel. So there's a dispersing of language that takes place, right? And let me just go ahead and say this. I used to be an English teacher for 7.5 years, right? But you don't have to be an English teacher to know that the English language breaks so many rules in order to accommodate itself, right? I feel like the English language is similar to the Greeks in their history. It's unreliable, right? The way this word looks like that one, this word looks like that one, you change that one, and then the way they sound is completely different. There's so much about that's different. Also, many of the words that we have now come from two different sources in the English language. One of them was from William Tyndall. who translated the Bible into English, if I'm not mistaken. And there were just certain ideas that did not translate into the English language. So he had to come up with words. He had to come up with words like mercy seat. He had to come up with words like atonement, just to accommodate these biblical ideas. So things like that are great. But then you've got people like Shakespeare, right? And Shakespeare's accredited with this massive volume of work, and he's introducing these words and ideas into the language. I'm getting so far off track. Let me get back to my point. I believe that there are things in the English language that we can connect to these old ideas or this old world occultism that we're not supposed to be able to trace the line to. I always like looking at etymologies, but every now and then I see connections that nothing online is going to tell me that they're connected, but I can't ignore it. The word rebel, I know that re means again, and then you've got bel. Well, what does bel mean? War. And it says here that Nimrod was the first to make war. So if Nimrod is really the hands of Cush, and Cush is the conception of the idea, and we already know that Cush is Bel, right? And keep in mind, this is right after the flood. If they're the first ones to start making war on people after the flood, right? I mean, think about the Civil War. What is it called? Antebellum, right? So Bel means war. To rebel means to make war again. So we have this demonic idea. And then I thought about something else. You've got the Tower of Babel. So when you divide that word, you've got Bab, which means gateway, El of God. But I even thought, what if you split it in a different place? And I'll grant you, this is my thinking. Nobody is necessarily saying this. I was like, well, what does Ba mean? And what would Bel mean? Ba, we know that Bel is this Lord or master, right? But Ba means to allot or to divide or to apportion. Right? So it could be the allotment of Bel. So it sounds to me like what Bel was trying to do at Babel was overridden by God. But we live in a culture now that's still leaning towards one world order. I know that we want to change the terminology and we want to call it globalization or globalism and all these things. And we're trying to do all these things in the name of humanity. But the agenda is the same, and it's there in the language. Right? So I saw the root Bel. I ran with it, and I think that just makes way too much sense for it to be a coincidence. Anyway, we talked earlier about Cush being associated with the name Hermes. Only problem is he is not the only figure in history that is associated with that name. There is a term in history that you may or may not be familiar with called Hermes Trismegistus. Didn't make this up. And I think this is really interesting. The ancient tradition of Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes, right? And we've already established that Hermes means son of Ham, but we'll come back to that, holds that this single name actually conceals three separate figures spread across three different eras, later fused by legend into one continuous identity. The first Hermes, according to this tradition, lived before the flood and is credited across Egyptian, Greek, Arabic, and Sufi sources with inventing writing and hieroglyphics, and with preserving sacred antediluvian knowledge on stone pillars ahead of the coming judgment. So if you followed this, maybe you know that the person that I'm talking about here would be the evil Enoch, right? Now, I think it's important to understand when you're looking at Masonic craft legends, they want to connect this evil Enoch, who is in the lineage of Cain, to the Enoch, which is in the lineage of Seth. And we cannot do those things, right? The crafts Enoch invented hieroglyphs specifically to conceal sacred knowledge from the uninitiated masses. In the name of Enoch, one definition can mean consecrated, which makes sense for the good Enoch, but the other meaning can mean the initiated. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. When you think about Enoch being, called to heaven, and he was not because the Lord took him, and everything that he was claimed to have done in the Book of Watchers, which I completely believe. But when you understand the Masonic craft legend of their Enoch, right, that in no way coincides with the righteous Enoch of the Bible. The first Hermes that we see who holds this secret knowledge. And again, I think on our last podcast, we talked about secret knowledge being represented by a pyramid or a temple with a light and an illuminated eye at the top, He is credited with building 9 underground vaults to preserve corrupted antediluvian science against the coming flood, with founding the first cities, keep that in mind, and with instituting sun worship and establishing festivals to the zodiac. Sounds like somebody else we just talked about. We talked about Cush, who is known for being the father of the Ethiops, that being synonymous with Bacchus and Bacchanalian sun worship. I know it's a lot of names to follow, but we're talking about a story that transcends different cultures and different times, and yet the thread holds. And so for that very reason, we can't dismiss it just because it gets hard. Like, if it's hard, listen to this again. I'm sure I'll probably make a condensed version of it at some point, but all of this makes sense. None of this fits with the biblical Enoch in the line of Seth, but it fits seamlessly with an entirely different Enoch mentioned earlier in Genesis, the son of Cain, for whom Cain named the very first city built by human hands. Now, why is this interesting? Because Cain has a son named Enoch, and he names the first city after him, and he builds it for him, supposedly, right? But we also know that Cain was a tyrant. We know that Cain acquired things by rape, violence, war, and the like. And we learned some of that from the Bible. We learned some of that from the writings of Josephus. You've got a man like Cain, and then you've got his son Enoch, who is initiated, or his descendant Enoch was initiated. That's before the flood. Now, after the flood, you've got this Cush character, who is the second part of Hermes Trismegistus, who is very similar to the Enoch before. And then you've got Nimrod, who sounds very much like Cain. We're talking about building cities. It seems like in these early episodes, we see cities being built against God, right? Because Cain was told to be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. The next thing you see him doing is building a city. Don't sound like he's trying to live by himself, right? The next thing we do is we see Nimrod and presumably Cush building this city and telling the people to gather together and attribute everything that they have and everything that they do to their own strength, when God told them to spread out. He told them to fill the earth and subdue it. He told them that when they were in the garden. He told them that on day 6, humanity, and they are disobeying as soon as they get off the ark. Now, why would you do that when you just saw what happens when people disobey God? What type of man must Nimrod have been, and what type of spokesman must Cush have been? The second Hermes in the Trismegistus tradition is a post-Diluvian figure who is said to have discovered one of this Canaanite Enoch's hidden pillars and translated its contents, carrying the corrupted scientists preserved there directly to the people of Babel. So the information that is from before the flood is found by Cush, who then relates it to the people at Babel. In Masonic legend, this figure is called Hermerinus and is described as descended from Shem. Only problem is that figure does not show up at all in the Table of Nations, so it sounds like a cleverly devised lie to steer us in the wrong direction. But Satan would never do that, would he? Would he? Anyway, Hislop's own etymology deepens this further. As we said before, he traces Hermes partly to Her, which he identifies with the Chaldee equivalent of Ham, the burnt one, the same root that underlies Chem, Egypt's own ancient name for itself, and the same root behind the word alchemy, from the Arabic alchemia, the black land. Now, again, going back to the English language, I believe to be demonically inspired. Isn't it interesting that so many words that we use every day sound like some type of derivative from these ancient language? We talked about Hermes, right? Her meaning ham, and then Hem meaning ham as well. You've got that KH sound that comes from Hem in a way, like, David's wife, Ahinoam. It doesn't translate so much in English because we just say Ahinoam, because it's nice to sound in English, but it's kind of got that sound to it. So we've got her talking about a woman. We've got him talking about a man. And that sounds like her and him. Okay, it sounds like you're making a big deal out of nothing. That's definitely a stretch for an idea. Not really. Let's keep going. You've got the term baby, or babby, as I think it's supposed to be called, because what do? All they do is babble. They speak in unintelligible utterances, similar to what you see at Babylon. Confusion. Okay. Her, ham, babby. What else do you have? You've got mama. Well, who was mama? Mama was a Sumerian deity of motherhood and nurturing and fertility. And then you've got Dada, or Dad, which sounds a lot like Ada, which had something to do with kingship. I forget what the other one was. But again, I just feel like there's too many similarities there in the language of English to this old language in Sumerian, Akkadian, Mesopotamian culture. And I believe that a lot of the stuff in this language is meant to be a nod to it. Now, why is all of this important? We said that Cush is Bel and Bel is Marduk, right? Oh, that's what I forgot to mention. I didn't highlight this part, but I feel like this is worth listening to. Hear me out, okay? To this meaning of the name of the Babylonian Bel, there is a very distinct allusion to Jeremiah 50, where it is said, Bel is confounded. That is, the confounder is brought to confusion. There's a man named Ovid, and I don't know if he's a historian or what it is. I haven't looked that far into it yet, but he refers to the god Janus. And Janus in this mythology is the god of all gods, or he is the god from which all other gods have their origin point. And in his writing, he says, the ancients called me chaos. Now, one of the things that we have to understand that chaos is a derivative of the name Cush. So you've got Cush, who also has this other name Janus in mythology, who is known as chaos. His symbol was the club, and the name of a club in Chaldee comes from the very words which signifies to break in pieces or to scatter abroad. So again, like when we look at the Tower of Babel and the languages being divided, people being scattered abroad, it's more than just a surface level story. God is hitting at the roots of their doctrine that Cush and Nimrod are enforcing. He who caused confusion of tongues was he who broke the previously united earth in pieces and scattered the fragments abroad. Janus having the club, it's like what God did to humiliate him, he is now trying to change to an attribute of his own character. I am the scatterer. I am the confounder. Now, the word there for to scatter is Hephaist, which in Greek mythology, that becomes very equivalent to Hephaestus, who is the god of the forge. And what does he have? A hammer. Hephaestus is the counterpart of another deity in another mythology known as Vulcan. And he is what? The father of the gods. Hephaestus is named of the ringleaders in the first rebellion, just as Bel was. And we can also see the idea behind Vulcan's hammer, which is another name for the club that Janus has. So the threads get a little hard to follow, but you've got this idea of this deity who takes his club or takes his hammer to smash or to scatter different things. What do we have being scattered? We have this civilization being scattered that was an affront against God, that was built up by Nimrod and built up by Cush, right? So obviously the story has to change in the aftermath to keep some type of hold on the adherents who are supposed to be following their doctrine. We've got this term Hermes Trismegistus, which means thrice great Hermes, talking about the evil Enoch before the flood who saved and preserved wicked doctrine. We've got Cush after the flood, who allegedly finds that information and uses it to build up Babel. And it's also believed that after Babel was destroyed and dispersed, he took that information to Egypt, which is where we get the thrice Hermes, who is the god Thought, who is believed to have brought civilization and language to his people. So you're seeing threads here that make way too much sense to dismiss. This is the type of deep thinking that I believe that we're supposed to understand in order to understand different parts of the Bible. I believe out of the shadows comes an individual like Cush, because just like today's society, it does not matter what you see and who's in control. There's always a mastermind behind it who you are not meant to see. I believe that's what Cush was trying to be. I think it's a beautiful thing that the Bible would tell us that God is not the author of confusion. I think it's always funny that we can find little scriptures like that. They bring peace to us in a way, but they carry so much subtle weight that we don't even realize until we've got more context. God is not the author of confusion. What is he saying there? In my personal life, whenever I'm having a hard time finding a solution, like, God, what am I supposed to be doing? I can take a step back and be like, wait a minute, God, confusion is not from you. Help me to clear everything out and get back on track. But now we're looking at these convoluted stories and bloodlines that are trying to make the God of gods, Cush, / Chronos / Janus / Hephaestus / Bacchus, Dionysus, and all these other people, the God of all gods, the God from whom all other gods have their origin. And he is the confounder. He is chaos himself. He is the God who defeats chaos. He's the God who brings chaos. He's the God who divides tongues and languages. And he claims to be the God of all gods. But our God tells us that that's not who he is. So he gives us peace and he addresses the lie in one short phrase. So God, my prayer for us is that as we close out of this, God, I just pray that whatever we're going through in our own lives, God, that you would just give us the grace to turn to you. And we just pray that you would cut through all confusion, because it is the trick of the enemy to bring confusion into our life whenever we're trying to make leeway. God, he tried to do it right after the fall of man in the garden. And he did it again, God, after man came out of the ark. And he still tries to do it in our everyday lives, God. He throws so much noise at us. Anything we want to believe, we can believe because it's in the news to tell us any and everything that we want to. But finding the truth has become so hard. But Lord, you are not the author of confusion. And we know that your word is sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing of soul and spirit. We pray that you would just cut through all the confusion and the chaos and tell peace to be still in our own lives. And grant us the peace that only comes from your presence, the one and true God who sits on the throne and who is blessed forevermore. And we bless your name. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, that's all I got for today. Till next time, take care.